Hi again. I want to talk to you today about Bible examples of overcoming fear. So, God is love. And since God is love, there's no fear in love. The Bible says there's no fear in love. And perfect love casts out fear. Well, fear should not have any place in our lives. We shouldn't be afraid of anything. There's nothing to be afraid of, really. The devil is the only opposition we have, and the devil has been overcome. He's been defeated by Jesus Christ. The people who side with the devil, they're the ones who are in danger. It's not us. They're the ones who are in danger of burning in hell for eternity. That's not us who's in danger. We have eternal life with God to look forward to. That's eternal. We have this short life on earth where we live through some hardships and some troubles come up, and we go through them and we're victorious over them because we don't live in fear. The reason you're victorious over your circumstances is because you don't live in fear. Fear is the devil's tool to try to destroy you because he comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Satan always comes to steal, kill, and destroy, and his method for destroying you is always going to include fear. He wants to make you afraid that you'll lose your job. He wants to make you afraid that you'll get sick. He wants you always in fear. That's the devil. The devil wants people in fear. God's not like that. God is love, and perfect love casts out fear. So there's no fear in love. So let's look at some examples of people in the Bible who overcame fear. Now, here in 1 Samuel and in chapter 17, we see the story of David and Goliath and how the Philistines were gathered. They had their armies gathered together, and Saul and Israel were gathered together against them. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was about 6 cubits in a span. In other words, this guy was huge. He had a helmet of brass on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. It was a heavy coat. In other words, this guy was strong and he was big. And what did they want to do, the Philistines? They wanted to make the Israelites afraid. It was all about fear here. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. And the spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. The thing was heavy. And he stood and cried, "Why are you come out to set your battle in array? Am I not a Philistine, and you servants of Saul? Choose a man and let him come down to me. If he will be able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail and kill him, then you shall be our servants." So basically, this is a fear tactic. Goliath is a giant. And this Philistine said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." So this Philistine was defying the armies of Israel. And who's Israel? Israel was the people God had chosen. And when Saul and all Israel heard the words of Goliath the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. They were afraid. They saw this giant and they're like, "Oh no, he's big, he's tough." Now David enters into the story, and David was the son of Jesse, and David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest were fighting with Saul against the Philistines. And the Philistine Goliath, he drew near morning and evening and presented himself for 40 days. And then Jesse said to his son, "Take now some corn and some loaves and run to the camp of your brothers." And so David rose up early in the morning, and he left the sheep, and because he was a shepherd. And as his father Jesse had told him, he came to the trench where his brothers were. And as David was talking with his brothers, there came the Philistine Goliath. He spoke those same words we saw him speak before, and David heard them. And all the men of Israel, they saw Goliath and they fled from him. They were afraid. And David spoke to the men that stood by and said, "What will be done for the person who kills this Philistine, this Goliath, and takes away the reproach from Israel?" In other words, David looked at this situation. He saw that Israel was being reproached by this Philistine. And he says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" In other words, David was recognizing that God was with Israel. That's how David was looking at this. He was saying, this Philistine, I don't care what his size is, I don't care how big he is, but he's defying the armies of the living God. And so Eliab, the eldest brother, heard when he was speaking to the people, asking, what shall be done for the man who kills Goliath. And his anger was kindled against David, and he said, "Why'd you come here?" Why'd you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? In other words, you're a shepherd, David. What are you doing here? He says, I know your pride, and you just came to you could see the battle. And he's just basically belittling David. And David says, what have I done? Is there not a cause? David says, well, is there not a cause? In other words, he sees that Israel is being defied, and he's not looking at the size of Goliath. He's looking at the fact that this giant is defying the armies of God because God is with Israel. And so David, here we see, just keeps talking to other people. He turned towards another person, and he spake in the same manner. And then it was reported to Saul what David was saying to these people, to these soldiers. And Saul sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him, because of Goliath. In other words, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of Goliath. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Isn't that something? Here's a shepherd. He's not even a soldier. And he says, you know what? I'm not afraid of this guy. He's defying the armies of God. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. Notice it's what Saul says. Saul says, you are not able. He's looking at his physical appearance. He's looking at David and he's saying, well, you're just a shepherd. You're just a youth. You're a youth. And he's a man of war from his youth. And David said to Saul, your servant has kept his father's sheep. And there came a lion and a bear and took out a lamb of the flock. And I went out after him and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and slew him. In other words, David has fought animals, protecting the sheep. David has a handle on the idea of the fact that God is his shepherd. God is the shepherd of Israel. David has an idea of this fact, that God is Israel's shepherd. And God is able to deliver Israel out of the mouth of the lion that comes and attacks, or the bear. And here's his parallel. He says, when they came after me, I just went after them and slew them. I killed that darn bear and that lion. I killed them. Your servant slew both the lion and the bear. He killed both the lion and the bear. And this uncircumcised Philistine Goliath shall be as one of them, seeing as, in other words, the reason being, seeing has defied the armies of the living God. He sees this as a shepherd would see it. He sees it how God is the shepherd of Israel. And he says, you know, it doesn't matter who goes and fights this Philistine. This Philistine is going to be defeated because God, the armies of the living God, God is the one who's with us. God is the reason he'll win. Not because he's a shepherd and not because he's big or small, but because God is with him. He has defied the armies of the living God. That's why this Philistine will lose. Not because he's not as strong. Of course, obviously he's a giant. He's stronger than anybody in the Israelite army probably. You know, that's why everyone's afraid of him. But that's not what David's looking at. He's looking past that. He says he's defied the armies of the living God. And then verse 37, David said, moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. Now, what did David say here? Does he say that I have a chance to beat this Philistine? Did he say that? He said, did he say I might be delivered out of the hand of the Philistine? He will, God, the Lord that delivered him from the lion and the bear, the Lord will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. He sees that God is the reason why he will win this battle. It won't be because he's stronger. Obviously, he's just a little shepherd boy. He's a youth. But it's the Lord. He will deliver me out of the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, go and the Lord be with you. But what did David have that made him look so foolish? He had faith. He said he will. He doesn't say he might. This is faith in action. Remember, what is faith? Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. There's no way you could see David beating this giant in a battle. There's no way you could see that. But here's what David says. David says he will. God will. The Lord will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. Not might. Not I might have a chance. No, he will. Because he realizes this is the Lord's battle. And so Saul armed David with his armor and put a helmet of brass on his head and gave him a coat of mail. And he basically said, I can't go with these. for I've not proved them. In other words, this armor isn't me. I'm not a soldier. This armor isn't me. I'm going to beat this giant without this armor. I don't need this soldier's armor. And David put them off of him. He took off the armor. He took off all the stuff that the soldiers would wear. He took all that off. He said, I'm going to be me. And he took his staff, his shepherd's staff. He took his staff in his hand. And he chose 5 smooth stones out of the brook and brought them in the shepherd's bag, which he had, even in a scrip, and his sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. Now, the thing is, you see that here that he chose 5. People say, well, why did he choose 5? He only needed 1 to take down this Philistine. Why did he choose 5? Why did he take 5 smooth stones out of the brook? Well, if you look at the story of Goliath, he had 4 brothers. And basically, David was saying, all 5 of them are going down. That's what David was saying here. So he took 5. This is how much faith he had. If he didn't believe he was going to live through his battle with Goliath, how was he going to live to beat all the other 4 brothers? How was he going to need 5 smooth stones? See, this is faith. This is faith right here. He chose 5. In other words, I'm going to live through this. Not only am I going to live through defeating Goliath, but I'm going to beat the other 4 brothers too. This is faith in action right here. This is faith. This is no fear. This is someone who has no fear. This is David saying, you know what? You're defying God. The reason he's not afraid is he understands this is the Lord's battle. So he chooses 5 stones out of the brook. And he puts them in his shepherd's bag. He's just going out to meet this giant with all his armor, with his shepherd's bag, and with 5 smooth stones. And he has his sling in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine Goliath. And the Philistine, he came on and drew near to David. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him. For he was but a youth and ruddy and of fair countenance. In other words, just a handsome kid, a young kid. He's a youth and he's a handsome young kid. And here this Philistine, this giant, is a man of war. This Goliath, he's been fighting since his youth. And he's a huge guy. And he's never lost a battle, obviously, or he wouldn't be standing there. And Goliath said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. In other words, Goliath cursed David by Satan, basically, because all idols are basically Satan. All idols are based in the worship of Satan. And so his gods, that's basically Satan. That's who Goliath was serving. He cursed David by his gods. There's no other God but the Lord. So any other gods that any man acknowledges, those are not gods. Those are basically tools of the devil, because the devil wants everyone to worship him. And the Philistine Goliath said to David, come, and I will give your flesh to the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then said David to the Philistine, to Goliath, you come at me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, who you have defied. So here is the whole cause in David's eyes. In David's eyes, the cause is the Lord of hosts, that this Philistine is defying the God of the armies of Israel. That's who the Philistine was defying. He wasn't defying the armies of Israel. He was defying God. He was defying the Lord of hosts, because the armies were the armies of God. The God of the armies of Israel. So what does David say? This day will the Lord deliver you into my hand. He's basically saying, the Lord's going to deliver you into my hand. Right in this giant space, David basically says, I'm going to kick your butt. The Lord is going to deliver you into my hand, and I will kill you. You know why? Because you've defied the Lord of hosts. You defied the God of the armies of Israel. That's who you've defied. So I'm going to kill you. David is not afraid of this giant. He says, I'm going to kill you. What is it that separates David from Saul? David is not afraid. He's speaking words of faith. He's speaking words of victory. He's saying, the Lord will, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. He will, not might. He's not saying, I have a chance against you. No, he's not saying that. He's saying the Lord will deliver. That's faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Whoever says to this mountain, go throw yourself in the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will happen, it shall be done for him. And out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. In other words, you decide what to say. And David decided to speak in line with faith in his God, faith in the Lord, the God of the armies of Israel. And so he just tells this giant, you're going to die. I'm going to kill you. And I'm going to take your head. I'm going to cut off your head. He just tells him, I'm going to cut off your head. And this is all words of faith right here. This is words of faith before he ever did anything. He didn't even raise his sling yet. And he tells Goliath, I'm going to kill you. You got no chance, buddy. You got no chance. Why? Because you're defying the Lord of hosts. And he says, I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air. All of them. All Goliath threatened David with was, he said, I will give your flesh, you David, I'll give your flesh to the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field. How does David answer? David says, I will smite you and take your head. I'll cut off your head. And I will give the carcasses of all the Philistines, the host of the Philistines, all of them, unto the fowls of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. So David's threat is much, much, much bigger than Goliath's threat. He's like multitudes more threatening than the Goliath is here. Goliath said, I'm going to feed you to the birds of the air. And David says, no, I'm going to feed all the Philistines, all of them, the host of the Philistines, all of you. I'm going to give all your carcasses, the host of all the Philistines, to the fowls of the air and the wild beasts of the earth. And all that is that the earth may know there is a God in Israel. In other words, who's going to win this battle for David? The whole reason he's fighting this battle is that the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. David knows that God is with him. He's been a shepherd. He's seen the lion and the bear come and try to steal his sheep. He's killed those bears and lions. He's seen that God delivered those into his hand. He knows that God is with him. He knows that God's with the people of Israel. Israel are the people of God, and they are the armies of God. So the reason David's going to defeat the Goliath and all the Philistines, the whole host of the Philistines, is that the earth may know that there's a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Who's going to give Goliath into the hands of the Israelites? God, the Lord. The battle is the Lord's. Whose is the battle? The battle's Lord. See, we take battles on ourselves so many times. We're afraid because we think, well, I have to fight this battle. No, you don't. No, the battle's the Lord's. If you're serving the Lord, you're part of his family. If you're a born-again child of God, you are a son of God. You're a daughter of God if you're a woman. You are a child of God. And the battle is the Lord's. When someone comes against you, they're defying the God of Israel, who's also your God. They're defying him. The battle is his, and he will give you Goliath into our hands. This is what David says. God will give you Goliath into our hands. These are words of faith. There's no evidence of any of this. There's no evidence that this little guy, this little shepherd, could take this huge giant and kill him. And then not only that, but the whole host of the Philistines, all the Philistines. This is David's threat. He says, I'm going to take down all of you, because you're all defying God. The Philistine Goliath, he was just one of them. He was the one who was coming out and speaking the words, but it was all the Philistines who were defying God. So it came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, and he ran towards the army to meet the Philistine. Now, a lot of people run away from danger. They'll see something and they're scared of it. They run in the other direction. David hastened. He ran towards the army to meet he ran towards the Philistine Goliath. He ran towards the giant that everyone was afraid of. Everyone's afraid of this giant. He ran right for it. He ran right for that giant. He ran for him. He wasn't afraid of this Philistine. He was showing by his actions that he was not afraid of this Philistine. Why was he not afraid? David had that revelation of the shepherd watching over his sheep. That's why he wasn't afraid. He knew God was the one who was going to win this battle. And so David, he just put his hand in his bag. He took out a stone and he slang it. And it hit the Philistine in his forehead, and the stone sunk into his forehead. Now, think about this for a minute. You know, that no matter how accurate his throw was, that stone was going to go and it was going to hit that Philistine in the forehead and it was going to sink in. He just threw the stone. That's all David did. And, you know, he may have been an accurate person with the sling, you know, yeah. And people give him credit for that. Okay, maybe he was. It didn't matter. It was God. He said the Lord was the one who was going to deliver him. He just kept saying that the Lord will give you into our hands. See, God was the one doing this battle. The battle is the Lord's. It's not David's. It's not based on his accuracy. It's not based on him throwing the sling around in circles hard enough to get it fast enough so it'll sink into the Goliath's forehead. No. What David had to do is he had to sling the stone. That's all he had to do. That's all David had to do. He had to run at the enemy and meet the enemy. That's what David's job was here. His job was to run towards the enemy and to take a stone and sling it. That was David's job. That's all he had to do. Once he slung that, the rest of this, who's the battle? The battle is the Lord's, and he is one who gave Goliath into Israel's hands. So all David did is he slung that stone. That stone struck that Philistine in his forehead, and that stone sunk into his forehead. That's supernatural right there. That sunk into his forehead. Goliath fell upon his face to the earth. He just basically was knocked out. When you're a shepherd boy, and you sling a stone at a giant the size of Goliath, this is not going to happen without God intervening. That stone sunk into his forehead and knocked him out. He fell upon his face to the earth. It knocked him out. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. And so what did he do after that? After that Philistine fell upon his face, what did David do? He fulfilled his word. He smote the Philistine and killed him. He slew Goliath with his own sword. He took Goliath's sword and he killed him with it. He cut off his head. He cut off the Philistine's head. And then what happens? When the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. Why? Because their confidence was based on his strength, on the earthly strength of Goliath. Their confidence was based on the strength of man. That's why the Philistines fled. They were afraid now. They fled. And the men of Israel, they were emboldened. They arose and shouted, and they pursued the Philistines. And the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way of Shurim, even unto Gath and unto Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines, and they spoiled their tents. They took all their goods. They spoiled the tents of the Philistines. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. So he took the Philistine's armor. So this is a classic story of faith. This is a story where David spoke and acted like there is a God in Israel. That's what he was acting like. He wasn't basing anything on the fact that he was a little boy and that giant was a huge giant. He wasn't basing any of the truth upon that. His truth was based on that guy. I don't care how big he is. He's defying God. He's defying the God of the armies of Israel. That was the whole basis for David fighting Goliath. And he, not a single shred of fear in David. Because why? Because he knew the battle was the Lord's. It wasn't his. It wasn't David's battle. It was the Lord's battle. Now, if you don't see the significance of the words David spoke, then you're missing the whole story. David, he spoke words of faith, and the result was victory. Why did he speak those words of faith? Because he understood, he believed that God was with him. That's why you can speak words of faith, because you understand that God is with you. If you don't understand that, you're going to be living in fear. If you don't understand that God is with you, that he's on your side, that he's going to help you, he's your God. So here we see that David understood this. He understood that these people were defying God, and they were defying the armies of God. And in the Old Testament times, that was, fighting against the Israelites, who the land of Israel was given to the Israelites. And these Philistines were opposing them. And that was defying God. It was defying what God said. God gave that land to Israel. So those Philistines were defying God. And they were doing it in the name of their gods. And their gods obviously were not the God of Israel, because they were defying the God of Israel. So the gods they were serving were Satan and his demons. That's who the Philistines were serving. And that's why they lost. And that's why David won, because David understood that was what the battle was. The battle wasn't about him and Goliath. It had nothing to do with them. It had to do with God and the enemies of God, which are the demons and the evil spirits and the devil himself. Satan had defied the God of Israel, who is the real God of the earth, and he'd gotten these Philistines to worship him. Satan had gotten the Philistines to worship him. And, that right there is what's going to kill you. That's the final destruction. This is just a small parallel of the big eternal truth of heaven and hell. Now, there are numerous stories in the Bible that show faith, and I could go on with a number of them, but I'm just going to give one more example here because I don't have time to go through all of them. But here's our second example. It's going to be Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In Daniel chapter 3, we see here that Nebuchadnezzar was the king, and Judah was in captivity, and Nebuchadnezzar was the king. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were three men they were Jews who worshiped God. And they defied the king's command to bow down and worship a golden image. There was a golden image that Nebuchadnezzar set up, and everyone was supposed to fall down and worship the image when all this music sounded, when they heard the sound of all this music. Then they were supposed to bow down and worship this golden image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So this was obviously an idol. And these Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the complaint came against them that they don't serve your gods, Nebuchadnezzar, and they don't worship the golden image which you have set up. So Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be brought to him. And so they brought them before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you don't serve my gods, nor worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready to fall down and worship these gods of mine, to fall down and worship this golden image, then go ahead and do it, and it's all well, it's all good. But if you don't worship my golden image, then you will be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God that shall deliver you out of my hands?" So here we see Nebuchadnezzar defying the God of the Jews, defying the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he's saying that, I'm going to throw you into a fiery furnace if you don't worship my golden image. Now, many people would hear this and they say, darn, okay, I'll worship your golden image. I don't want to be thrown in a fiery furnace. See, that's fear. What did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we're not careful. We're not careful to answer you." They're not even concerned in their answer. They tell the king who's ruling the land where they're in captivity. He says, "Oh, we're not careful to answer you in this matter. There's not even any doubt of how we're going to answer you in this matter." He says, "If it be so, if you're going to throw us in this fiery furnace," he says, "if you don't worship his golden image, then he's going to throw you in this burning fiery furnace." That's what he was telling Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He says, "If it be so, if you're going to throw us in the fiery furnace, then our God whom we serve is able." It doesn't say here he might be able to. He might be able to deliver us from the fiery furnace. No, he says, the God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. Then what do they say next? "And he might deliver us out of your hand, O king." Is that what it says? It says he will, not he might, he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. That's words of faith. This is just like David. This is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego understanding this is a defiance against God. God is the one who's going to fight this battle. They understand this. They say God will. He might. Just like David said, I'm going to kill you, Goliath. The same thing here. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said he will. God will deliver us out of your hand, O king. He's able to, and he will deliver us. So if you do throw us in this fiery furnace, God will deliver us out of your hand. And if you don't throw us in the fiery furnace, some people say, well, this is if God doesn't deliver us out of your hand. No, that's not what they're saying. They just got through saying He will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if you don't throw us in the fiery furnace, because the first if is if you throw us in the fiery furnace, God will deliver us from the fiery furnace. But if you don't throw us in the fiery furnace, then we will not serve your gods nor worship the golden image which you have set up. Now, this is the only way you can possibly interpret this verse. I've seen people misinterpret this over and over again. I've heard people say, oh, well, even if God doesn't deliver us, we're not going to serve your God. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Not only did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego just say he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. Not only that, but if this was talking about him not delivering them, they'd be dead. They couldn't serve his gods or worship the golden image, which he set up, because they'd be dead. They'd be burning in the fiery furnace. See, this is not about whether or not God's going to deliver them. They already said, God will deliver us out of your hand, O king. If you throw us into the fiery furnace, if it be so, if you throw us in the fiery furnace, then God will deliver us out of your hand. But if you don't throw us in the fiery furnace and you let us live, we're not going to serve your gods, because we'll still be alive. We will not serve your gods nor worship the golden image which you have set up. This is absolute defiance of the king. These are words of absolute faith. This is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego telling them, God will deliver us out of your hand, O king. In his face, just like David did to Goliath. When David spoke to Goliath, he said, you know what, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to cut off your head. It's exactly what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are saying. He will deliver us out of your hand, O king. You could try to throw us in a fiery furnace, but God's going to deliver us out of it. If you throw us in the fiery furnace, God is able to deliver us from what? The burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, if you don't throw us in the fiery furnace, we're not going to serve your gods. This is absolute defiance. Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and his countenance was changed, and he commanded that the furnace should be heated 7 times hotter than it's normally heated. And he commanded the most mighty men in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the fiery furnace. So they were bound in their coats, in their clothes, in their hats, and their garments. Okay, so their garments at the very least would have caught fire, okay? And they were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And because the king's command was so urgent, the furnace was so exceedingly hot, the flames of fire killed. They slew the men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Who are these people? These were the most mighty men in his army. They're the ones who bound Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the fiery furnace. And those men, they were slain. They all died throwing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace. They died throwing them in. And there goes the 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They fell down, bound in their clothes into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, was astonished. And he rose up in haste and spoke and said, wait, did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? And they said, yes, that's true, O king. And he said, look, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. So that was an angel of God, or maybe it might have been Jesus. We don't know, but that was someone God sent to hang out with them in the middle of this furnace. So they're just hanging out in the middle of this fiery furnace that's 7 times hotter than any furnace that had ever been heated by Nebuchadnezzar before. The most mighty men in his army died, throwing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace. They all died. But here they are walking around. They're just walking around in the midst of the fire. And this 4th one is hanging out with them. And Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and he said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you servants of the Most High God. Whose opinion has changed here? I'd say Nebuchadnezzar's opinion has changed a little, wouldn't you? You servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they came forth out of the midst of the fire. I think that's just so funny. They just came right out. They just came right out. They walked right out of the fiery furnace. I mean, come on. They just came forth out of the fiery furnace, and they fell bound in, so they had to go up an incline to get out of this furnace. And they walked right out of it. And the princes and governors and captains of the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power. Why? Because Nebuchadnezzar defied the God of Israel. He had defied the true living God. And he wanted these 3 to worship a golden image, an idol. And so what happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Nothing. Their bodies, the fire had no power over them. There wasn't a hair of their head singed. Not even a hair of their head was singed. Neither were their coats changed. In other words, their clothes were intact. Their clothes, at the very least, would have burned up if this was a case where the fire was going to take its natural toll. Well, obviously it didn't. Nor the smell of fire passed on them. In other words, they didn't even smell like they had been in a fire. They were completely unaffected by the fire. Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and has delivered his servants that trusted in him. Faith. They trusted in God. And they have changed the king's word. They defied the king's word. And they yielded up their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any God except their own God. They refused to worship any God except their own God. And then what happens as a result? He made a decree. The king made a decree that everyone, whoever spoke a single word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would be cut in pieces. Because why? There is no other God that can deliver after this sort. And then what happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? They were promoted. The king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So this is how it is with faith in God. If you just are not afraid, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't, they weren't afraid. They're like, go ahead, throw us in. Throw us in. We don't care. We're not careful to answer you in this matter. You want to throw us in like fire? Yeah, go ahead. Throw us in this burning fiery furnace. God will deliver us. They said God will. He will deliver us. And then they even said, if you don't throw us in the fiery furnace, we're not going to serve your God. In other words, they were egging the king on. They were saying, go ahead, throw us in. Go ahead. Throw us in the fiery furnace. We don't care. And of course, they weren't even touched by that fire. David and Goliath. David told that giant, he said, you know what? I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you. You're defying my God. You're defying the real living God. He understood who the enemy was. He understood the enemy was not this giant. The giant was just a person who is acting on behalf of the false gods, the demons, the devil, basically. Same thing here. Nebuchadnezzar, he was just a tool of the devil. And in this case, we see where, God exposed Nebuchadnezzar and said, listen, you're worshiping the wrong God. He just told the king outright here, he said, listen, you think you're worshiping the right God? Well, look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego here. So this is how it is when you have faith in God. When you have faith in God, he'll come through for you. God comes through. He's not the kind of God who's going to leave you hanging. That's the difference between fear and faith right there. Fear and faith are opposites. Fear is the lack of love. Perfect love casts out fear. So love casts out fear, and fear is the tool of the devil. And God is love. What a coincidence. God is love. The devil promotes fear. It's just that simple. God always wins. If we put our trust in him, our faith is what will see us through. If we look at 1 Peter and chapter 2, It tells us a very simple fact. For in the scripture it says, see, I lay a stone in Zion, that's Jesus, a chosen and precious cornerstone, and the one who trusts in him will sometimes be put to shame. Does it say that? It says, he who trusts in him will never, 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 never be put to shame. If you put your trust in God, you will never be put to shame. If we look at 1 John chapter 4 and down here at verse 18, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. Because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. This tells you everything you need to know right here. There is no fear in love. If someone's trying to get you to be fearful, they're the problem. They're the one who's in the wrong. If you trust in God, you will never be put to shame. And God is love. Perfect love drives out fear. We read just up a little bit further here. It says, whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. God is love. There is no fear in love. Perfect love drives out fear. It drives out fear. So that pretty much outlines having faith in God and the result of having faith in God. And putting your trust in him, you will never be put to shame. It's going to take faith on your part. It's going to take you acting like the Word of God is true. It's going to take you speaking like the Word of God is true. That's what faith is. That's what it's going to take for you to get your breakthrough. But you will never be put to shame if you do trust in God. If you put your trust in him, put your words and your actions in line with what he says, you will not be put to shame. You won't be. Period. The end. So that's my message for today. Thanks for watching.